Okay, our guest is Ambassador Mark Brzezinski, former U.S. Ambassador to Sweden and former Executive Director of Arctic Executive Steering Committee, Office of the White House. Long introduction. Thanks for joining us, Mr. Ambassador.
Delighted to be here. Thank you for having me. And I'm so thrilled that you're having this important conference now on this topic, because the looming crisis in the Arctic is a preview of the looming crisis of the global condition. It's great that we're focusing on the Arctic here at the Woodrow Wilson Center.
Wow, great, thank you. I want to ask you, we were chatting before we began recording, and I was offering condolences on the loss of your father.
Thank you.
And you talked about how he saw this Arctic focus coming a long time ago.
Yes, my father, Dr. Zbigniew Brzezinski, had many, many talents, one of which was to really look to the future and spot trends and see changes in direction. And as a strategist, he was successful because he was able to advise presidents on how to position themselves, remain flexible, and be able to pivot and move quickly when the time was right in the American interest. The Arctic was one of my father's favorite topics. The Arctic is far away. For many Americans, it's an esoteric, almost extraneous topic. But for my father, the Arctic was a foreshadow. It was a preview of the global condition. And he wanted America to be better prepared to know more about what is coming our way from a better understanding of the Arctic. So you're absolutely right in invoking my father. He really zeroed in on the Arctic for that reason.
Along those lines, how close are we to a tipping point where, you talk to someone from Oklahoma, they don't think of themselves as an Arctic nation, right?
Right.
Because of the geography. Are we getting closer to a point where people's awareness of the Arctic is at the level internationally as it is currently regionally?
Well, I feel that in many ways Americans don't fully appreciate that we are an Arctic country, and one of the biggest challenges to us who care about the Arctic for different reasons. The Arctic is a lot of different things. It's native and tribal, it's state and local, it's about biology and ecosystems, it's about resources, it's about an international context, and there's different reasons to care about the Arctic, but a very small percentage of Americans really embrace our narrative and identity as a country, as an Arctic nation. And so therefore one of our challenges is communicating the Arctic. And to communicate the Arctic, you have to make the case as to why the Arctic is important to you, fellow Americans, for you in your own backyard. That case can be made based on the science that we see coming out of the Arctic. If anything we can conclude, it's that we have underestimated the acceleration of the change in the Arctic and the relevance of, to you, person in Oklahoma, or you, person in Texas, or elsewhere, is that your children or your children's children will inherit a world in which the basic outline of society is contracting because of sea level rise, coastal erosion. America's first Arctic refugee, America's first climate refugees are Alaskans, fellow Americans who live in Alaska, who are having to leave their villages and town because they're washing away into the sea because of sea level rise and coastal erosion.
Wow. So right now, just about everyone we talk to stresses how much cooperation is taking place regionally, really in contrast to what's happening in many other regions of the globe among the same nations.
Yes.
How long can that continue until we start to see conflict?
Great question, because I do feel that the cooperation we see in the Arctic now is vulnerable to the politicization of the issue of the Arctic. The Arctic as a topic is not yet politicized. And when issues become politicized, it's much more difficult for different national counterparts to find areas of mutual cooperation. And therefore, time is on our side now, and we have to seize the moment to work together with others to develop alignments to advance the American interest, but also the global interest when it comes to sustainability and the environment, safe and secure shipping and maritime routes, sustainable resource exploitation, and advancing the interests of the people of the Arctic, who are increasingly, thank goodness, finding their own voice. The millions of people who live in the Arctic, who make the Arctic their home are no longer isolated and therefore unable to communicate, thankfully. They can communicate, and we hear their needs, and there are some crying social needs in the Arctic that need to be addressed. It's not new to them.
Lived it all their lives.
That's right.
As far as Trendlines, in honor of your father's way of thinking, what are the ones that you think are the most important for us to focus on?
A couple. First of all, the science of the Arctic is showing us trend lines in terms of change there that we've underestimated the acceleration of, and which absolutely are a window to our own future. Whether it's permafrost melt that releases carbon into the atmosphere and methane, whether it's the rising sea level because of melting glaciers and ice structures, whether it's ocean acidification, the trend lines are negative in terms of the biological context of the Arctic, and our scientists don't fully yet understand the full comprehensiveness and context of that change. Two, business and commerce. The Arctic will see more commercial activity, whether in terms of shipping and maritime, in terms of resource exploitation, mineral exploitation, and the sooner that we develop a common understanding of what will not produce deep water horizon and protect against that, the better off we are. Because if there's anything that Deepwater Horizon, the horrible oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico showed, is that there will be mass outrage on the part of our fellow Americans if there is an oil disaster in a frontier area like the Arctic because of mismanaged science or mismanaged resource exploitation, or somehow hiding the vulnerability of the situation. That is no longer accepted. Deepwater Horizon raised the bar in terms of the science and management of resource exploitation. That is another trend line. Third, just increasingly the voice of the people of the Arctic is being heard, and we need to respond to that. There are terrible social problems in the Arctic, whether it's suicide, whether it's substance abuse, terrible family problems and spousal abuse. Reports and indexes show that these are problems that cannot and will not be ignored. These are our fellow Americans. Maybe it's not a huge number of fellow Americans, but they are our fellow Americans, and these problems affect us all. And we have a moral obligation. We have a moral obligation as a country to address them.
I'm guessing the optimistic thought here is that the increased attention will lead to addressing these
That's
issues
right.
you described.
Well, exactly. We're here in Washington, and in certain ways, the squeaky wheel gets the most oil in Washington, D.C. The Arctic voice is louder and louder. That's good.
Ambassador Brzezinski, thank you very much, not just for this interview, but for joining us for this Arctic Forum
Thank you
as well.
Thank you for the opportunity.